The format of this video is going to be a little bit different than my usual. This video is not quite as thoughtfully scripted or edited as most of my other work. Mostly, I will just be ranting about my frustrations with the post-campaign content of Gran Turismo 7. If you haven't already seen it, then I highly recommend that you watch my previous 2 videos about Gran Turismo 7. The first one being about the reward and progression systems of the campaign, and the second about how the motion steering of the PS5's DualSense controller has revolutionized how I play console racing games. Anyway, while I was playing through some of the late game content in order to collect footage for that second video, I became frustrated with a couple issues that had only really become prominent in the later stages of the game, which is why I didn't really encounter them much while I was playing the campaign and putting together that first video. So they didn't make it into that first video. The major thesis of my first video about the campaign of Gran Turismo 7 was the juxtaposing and contradictory design philosophies of the game's campaign. Specifically, how the game is more about collecting cars than about actually racing them. This comes through in the game's campaign objectives, which almost all revolve around acquiring specific cars rather than on winning races. I'm not going to go into this because I spent an entire previous video talking about it. Anyway, something I didn't really talk about before is how the relative lack of racing events both demonstrates this emphasis on collecting rather than on racing the cars, while also almost paradoxically undercutting the car collection as a motivation factor for players. I'm definitely not the first person to say this, but there simply aren't enough events to actually make use of all the cars that are in Gran Turismo 7. Heck, there isn't even enough variety in events to make use of all the different types of cars, let alone every make, model, and year. By halfway through the campaign, I was already acquiring cars that I struggled to find a use for. There aren't many specialized events for the historic cars, which usually have poorer performance compared to newer cars and so aren't very good to race in just the PP restricted races. I think there was one racing event that specifically required the 1965 Mini Cooper, and then later in the game there are some Ferrari and Porsche exclusive racing events, but those Ferrari and Porsche events are for any Ferrari or Porsche regardless of model or year. So the game still heavily favors newer models, and it doesn't really give the player much if any opportunity to utilize any of the various vintage models. That's about it, as far as make, model, or year exclusive events are concerned in the entire campaign of Gran Turismo 7. Like, this is definitely not like a Gran Turismo 2 where almost every single manufacturer had like one or more model-specific racing events. Like, that's just not in the game anymore. Other historic cars that you may collect do not have specific race events dedicated to them, and so they don't feel worth owning because they're never useful. And then, of course, there's the fact that the game's collector level maxes out by the time you've got just 1/3 of the cars in the game, which is just, Like, is this a racing sim, a car collecting game, or just a guided museum tour? Like, make up your mind's polyphony, because right now you're trying to do all 3, and I'm sorry, but you're just not doing any of them particularly well. There's also relatively few, if any, events for some of the more specialized classes of cars. Like, there's only a few rally events, there's only one set of 3 races for pickup trucks, and there's no SUVs in the game at all, despite the fact that SUVs are still, for some reason, the most popular type of car in North America.
I'm a marketing manager who lives in the suburbs and commutes to work on the highway. I live alone, so of course I needed a car that could seat 12 and is equipped to drive across Arctic tundra. It just makes me feel better.
The new Maibatsu monstrosity. Mine is bigger.
And there's absolutely no specialized races for electric vehicles or hybrids, even though the game gives the player a trophy for buying your first electric car. There's no events in which you can specifically use that electric car, so, like, why does the game make a big deal about you getting one? The EV thing in particular was a big hang-up for me because I personally would love to have seen a bit more variety in the available EVs and hybrids, as well as some events to pit them against each other. There's only a few stock EVs in the game, including the Tesla Model S, Porsche Taycan, and the BMW IDR. The rest of the EVs are just the VGT cars, the Vision Gran Turismo vehicles, which are not real cars, and which I don't really care to play because they aren't real cars. There's no Chevy Volt or Nissan Leaf or Prius Prime or Kia EV6 or any of the other popular economy EVs. It would have been nice to see these EVs added to the game, along with some dedicated races for them to compete in. It also would be nice to have some race events for the higher-end EVs, like the Tesla and Porsche Taycan, especially if Polyphony threw in one or more EV sports cars for them to compete against. You know, maybe something like the Ford Mustang Mach-E, or the Kia EV6 GT, Audi e-tron, or the BMW i3 EV. As for hybrids, there's the Toyota Prius and the Honda Fit, as far as the economy end of the spectrum goes. But then, of course, there are no low PP hybrid events in which to race them. On the sports car end of the spectrum, there's the NSX and LeFerrari hybrids, but again, no high PP hybrid events in which to race those cars. And being someone who lives in America and seeing SUVs and trucks dominating the roads and highways, it's just kind of weird for me to not see SUVs or trucks being represented in the game at all. There's like 2 token pickup trucks in the entire game, and only a few races in which to use them. Maybe Polyphony could have thrown in a Dodge Ram or a Chevy Silverado, and then, as I said before, there's absolutely no SUVs in the game at all. Some good options for SUVs could have included the Toyota RAV4 or the Highlander, maybe a Ford Explorer, a Jeep Wrangler, maybe even a Hummer, I don't know. Lots of options here, but again, there's just none. Apparently, Polyphony does not like SUVs. And then, I don't know, like, if you're going to include some pickup trucks and SUVs, maybe you could actually have some actual rally events for these off-road trucks and sport utility vehicles to participate in. Or, I don't know, maybe we don't. Given their high centers of gravity and tendency to roll easily, maybe SUVs and pickup trucks aren't the best candidates for rally. But hey, it would be nice to be able to drive them like all the TV commercials pretend that they're supposed to be driven. And there is one single pickup truck dirt rally event in the game, so it's not like Polyphony is fundamentally opposed to having something like that in the game. They're clearly not worried about the rollover risk in that case. Even outside of these specialized vehicles, there's also a frustrating lack of variety in events for the other vehicles that are in the game. If you have a street car with more than like 700 performance points, it's really hard to find a race event that it qualifies for and will be competitive in, because most of those race events are expecting grade 4 or grade 3 race cars. So I paid millions of credits for this awesome Ferrari F50 from the Haggerty collection, which is one of my favorite cars ever, by the way, but I feel like I can't really use it anywhere outside of the couple Ferrari-specific events because its performance is too high for events with other road cars, but it doesn't perform well enough against the grade 4 or grade 3 race cars to really be competitive in those events. It's certainly fast enough to compete, but in my experience, it burns through way too much fuel too quickly, and it forces me to make more pit stops than I can afford to make, and we'll get to that. So if you want to race cars like this, like, you're kind of just stuck replaying the same events over and over and over again and taking their paltry payouts. I guess I could create custom events in order to use some of these valuable cars that I paid for, but their payouts are even more pathetically low, and they just don't feel worth the time. And as a bit of an aside, one way that I think Polyphony could address the issue with low payouts for older events, while simultaneously adding a bit more variety to the game's events, would be to take a page out of Dark Souls 2's playbook. That game included an item called a Bonfire Ascetic, which, when used at a bonfire checkpoint, would increase the difficulty of the given area as if it were in a New Game Plus. The enemies would get harder, the boss and loot would respawn, experience rewards would be increased, and even some new higher-level enemies, phantoms, and loot would appear. Gran Turismo 7 could do something like this with its events. After you've beaten an event with first place, the game could allow you to increase the difficulty of the event and try it again. The AI cars could get faster and more aggressive, maybe the PP restrictions could be tightened, penalties could get stricter, and the payouts should then be multiplied. This would encourage the player to re-challenge earlier events with different cars and actually get a meaningful reward payment for your efforts. It would also give the player an opportunity to use more of the gift cards in the events from which they were originally received. But really, I admit that complaining about the lack of content is kind of a petty and almost narcissistic complaint. I'm sure everybody is probably going to have some favorite car that they wish was in the game, but obviously Polyphony cannot include every single car in the world in this one game. The specific issue, however, that was the impetus for this rant is Gran Turismo 7's take on endurance races. I don't think any of these race events show up as part of the campaign. They're basically all endgame content, and so I hadn't played any of them prior to creating my video about GT7's campaign. Now that I've finished the campaign, I'm playing more of these events, and I'm getting really annoyed and frustrated by them, for a variety of reasons. For one thing, the fact that these events are not included as part of the campaign means that the campaign never has an opportunity to tutorialize or explain the penalty system that comes along with these events and which really isn't implemented in any of the previous events. Not understanding how these penalties are triggered or what I'm supposed to do to avoid them was driving me nuts for weeks of playing through some of these events. What exactly does the game expect me to do during a yellow flag or a blue flag? Thanks for not warning me in advance that I cannot cross the solid white lines going into or out of the pit. Okay, now, to be fair, it's on me that I don't know the rules of auto racing, because I think all of this stuff is just pulled exactly from the real sport. So this is kind of like expecting a game like Madden NFL to explain every single rule of football to a new player. We'd be here all day.
I've been broadcasting NFL games for 20 consecutive years. I've never seen them. Well, I've been around.
But these Gran Turismo penalties aren't some fringe edge case like a QB drop kicking the ball for an extra point, or the fair catch kick rule, or something like that in football. These penalties are core rules of competitive Gran Turismo events that only come into play in the late game and in multiplayer. I really think that an explanation is warranted, since those things had no effect through the vast majority of players' playtime and then suddenly come into effect near the end of the game. So it's like you have to learn a new set of rules all of a sudden. Maybe there should be a license test that explains penalties and flags, and that the player cannot enter any of these single-player events that use those rules until they've completed the license. But then again, none of the license tests in Gran Turismo 7 are actually required in order to play any of the events in the campaign, so whatever. Gran Turismo 7 spends so long giving me lectures about car history, I think they could have spared a few minutes to explain the rules of the sport too. Anyway, on to the endurance races themselves. Instead of Polyphony expecting the players to race hundreds of laps over the course of real-life hours, like they used to do in the older games and like how actual real-life racing works, Polyphony wanted to keep these races in the 30-minute range. A few go as long as an hour. So what Polyphony did is they abstracted the longer races and compressed the time it takes to race them. Instead of doing 100 laps, Gran Turismo 7 expects the player to race 10 laps. But in order to make fuel consumption and tire wear into relevant mechanics, they multiply those by a factor of 10 or sometimes more. So even within the span of 10 laps, which is only about twice as long as most regular races are, you'll still have to pit once or twice in order to replace tires or to refuel. This is fine in principle, and I admit it could probably work in practice too. I just don't think that it works in the way that Polyphony implemented it in Gran Turismo 7. So first, I'll admit, this is a pretty cool optional way to play an endurance race, and it's actually a very good compromise for online play. Online multiplayer requires keeping a stable connection between 20 different players, so shortening the amount of real time that it takes to complete a race in this fashion increases the likelihood of consistently finishing a session without too many players, if any at all, dropping their connections, while also still maintaining some of the strategy of longer endurance races. So far, so good. Unfortunately, for those of us who predominantly or exclusively play offline single player, all of the single player endurance races work like this too. So unlike with Gran Turismo 4 and 5's B-Spec mode, Gran Turismo 7 doesn't even give players the option or possibility of playing the entirety of an hours-long endurance race. With a full-time job, 2 kids, a blog and a YouTube channel to maintain, and other professional, personal, and social obligations, I sure as heck do not have the time nor the inclination to play through the entirety of a 24-hour Le Mans event. But I wouldn't mind having more events that are an hour or 2 or maybe even 3 hours in duration. That's perfectly doable given my time constraints. And I also wouldn't mind being able to coach a B-Spec AI driver for a 24-hour event at like 10x or 20x speed, and maybe even have the option to take manual control for some key laps here and there. But those are just not options in Gran Turismo 7 at all, even though it's all precedented in previous Gran Turismo games. Well, that is, unless you try to create a custom race, and you don't mind the pathetically paltry reward payouts that they offer. And it's particularly disappointing because Gran Turismo 7 has a suite of new features that would be really conducive to longer races. The new day-night cycle and dynamic weather help longer races to feel more dynamic and less rote, while also adding their own additional layers of strategy. The weather in particular makes your options for tires and handling configurations that much more important and varied. The ability to adjust your fuel consumption rate during a race adds an extra element of strategy beyond just tire wear. And then the aforementioned penalty, flag systems, and clean race bonuses enforce rules of sportsmanship and etiquette that encourage more conservative and technical driving. All of these combine to make longer endurance races potentially more dynamic, strategic, and competitive, assuming that the AI cars are able to keep pace with the player for an entire hour or 2 or 3 hour event. But these events only being 10 laps and about half an hour long each makes all of these new features feel less impactful and meaningful than they could and probably should be. And speaking of the dynamic weather, I've got complaints about that too. The condensed endurance events make this feature almost as annoying as it is fun. Because the events only last half an hour instead of multiple hours, the speed of weather changes also has to be sped up. Instead of clouds rolling in and dropping some rain over the course of hours, it has to happen within minutes. Seriously, look at this screenshot from the World Touring Car 700 event at Sarth. Note the blue skies and lack of any precipitation on the radar. Now here is a screen from that same race about 2 minutes later. Note the completely gray, overcast skies, the pouring rain, and the heavy precipitation on the radar, which all just literally came out of nowhere. These rapid changes in weather actually undermine a lot of the strategy associated with preparing your car for weather events. I don't see the storm clouds gathering and wonder, should I pit now and put on those rain tires even though I don't actually need to pit otherwise? Or should I try to ride it out for a few more laps until I actually need to take my regular pit stop and then change my tires then, but take the risk of having to slow down if it starts raining in the meantime? Instead, the sky might go from sunny and dry to torrential downpour over the course of a single lap, forcing me to wait until it's already raining to switch my tires in order to avoid losing precious seconds from my lap time, which is important because you start at the back of the race, and we'll talk more about that later. And this might be confirmation bias at work, but I feel like as soon as I switch to rain tires, the rain will just stop and clear up. And if I switch to my rain tires before it actually starts raining, like a lap early, the rain never actually comes in, or if it does, it doesn't fall hard enough to ever warrant needing the rain tires to begin with. It's so frustrating. Now, if this were a 2 or 3 hour long race, we could have situations in which the clouds roll in gradually over the course of like 30 or 60 minutes, and then they drop continuous rain over maybe an hour or longer before clearing up a bit at the end of the race. That would be way better than the sudden torrential downpour coming out of nowhere and then disappearing to nowhere over the span of like 3 or 4 minutes. Also, would it kill Polyphony to give us a warning that it might rain in the event prep menu, like a little weather forecast widget or something somewhere, so that it's not quite as much of a surprise when it does suddenly start pouring rain in the middle of a 30-minute long event? Another big problem with how Gran Turismo 7's streamlined endurance races work is that pit stops take too goddamn long. The older games would have pitting cars actually drive through the pit, stop in their stalls, get serviced, and then drive out, all in real time. In Gran Turismo 7, a car that enters the pit literally just disappears. Then we watch a cutscene of the pit crew literally just standing around for like 20 seconds or longer before the car suddenly pops back into existence and pulls into the stall. A pit stop taking 40 seconds or longer isn't unrealistic in and of itself. A pit stop is a serious commitment for a real-life race car driver that can cost that racer a half a lap or a whole lap in time, and probably also multiple pole positions. There's valid strategy to consider between focusing on speed and handling at the cost of tire durability and fuel consumption versus taking harder tires and a slower car that will have to pit less frequently but could potentially gain pole positions while the other faster cars are pitting. Either way, if the race is 100 or 200 laps long, there's plenty of time to make up those laps lost to pitting, especially since every car is also pitting multiple times. But with only 10 laps and 1 or 2 pit stops, there simply is not time to make up an entire lost lap or two. Really, the only viable strategy is to make sure that you pit no more often than the rival cars, which usually make 1 pit stop for shorter tracks and 2 pit stops for longer tracks. Now, whether you do that by using the fuel map or by short shifting your car, which the internet says is currently the optimal way to save fuel while maintaining performance, that's totally up to you. But either way, you really cannot afford to take even just 1 single extra pit stop more than the other cars if the race is going to be this short. The lack of time to make up for position lost to pitting is compounded by the fact that the player always starts at the back of the pack and has to work your way up to the front. I already talked about this problem briefly in my previous video, and about how it encourages using overpowered cars and makes most races feel non-competitive and therefore not really all that fun. I'm not going to rehash all that here, but something that I did not discuss previously is how this design butts up against the clean race bonus rewards and on the idea of sportsmanship and racing etiquette. Gran Turismo 7 wants to encourage the player to drive cleanly and with proper sportsmanship. The player is explicitly punished in many races, especially in multiplayer, for going off the track or for colliding with other cars or the walls. And failing to earn the clean race bonus is basically just forfeiting a whole 1/3 of your potential prize money. So if you're trying to grind up some money to buy an expensive new car on your wish list, then you probably want to drive cleanly in order to earn all those clean race bonuses. But then the game goes and starts us off at the back of the pack every single race, which forces us to have to drive aggressively and probably also a little bit recklessly just to catch up and compete for a podium position, let alone to win first place. And if you're racing one of these abstracted endurance events, you might find that as soon as you catch up and make it into the top 10 positions, it's time to pit, and you lose almost all of your gains. So you have to come out of the pit and drive even more aggressively for the second half of the race in order to both regain your lost position, but also to catch up to those leading cars. Sure, one could argue that this is all part of the challenge, and winning a race after having started at the back of the pack certainly does qualify as a challenge. But personally, I don't find it to be nearly as compelling a challenge as racing against a worthy and competitive rival would be. I would much rather start at like 6th out of 20 and be racing against cars that perform similarly to mine, and with the actual possibility that the cars behind me will possibly catch up and overtake me if I'm driving sloppy. You might also say that if I want competitive races, then I should just go to multiplayer. But there's a couple problems with that too. First of all, the single-player campaign is basically going out of its way to teach and reward unsportsmanlike driving. You have to drive aggressively in order to win in the single-player campaign. But then if you go into multiplayer, the game is actually ranking you based on your sportsmanship. It will heavily penalize you for collisions and other violations of etiquette, which, by the way, the single-player campaign never explains or teaches, and many players in the community will even record races or replays and then publicly shame the other drivers on Reddit for aggressive or sloppy driving in online events. And it also doesn't help that Polyphony apparently programmed the AI drivers to be almost completely oblivious to the existence of the player's car on the track. The AIs have absolutely no reservations about bumping, clipping, ramming, or outright running the player's car off the road. So people playing predominantly single player don't even have the AI cars to model good driving etiquette for them before they go into trying multiplayer. So I don't blame anybody for feeling intimidated and put off by trying to race in online races. Honestly, I'm super intimidated by it myself, and I've gone through the entire single-player campaign and a large chunk of the post-campaign content without having done multiplayer at all. But even if you are comfortable with competing against other player racers, and you're skilled and confident enough to race with proper etiquette and sportsmanship, you still have to deal with all the other frustrating problems that are inherent to online play. You know, poor internet connections because I live in the USA, which has a shitty privatized broadband internet infrastructure, or low ping times, or lag, or any other issues that can render races unplayable. Or, you know, the whole game might just go offline for days at a time. Who knows? So yeah, there's going to be some entitled elitist players who are just going to say, we'll just race in multiplayer. But, like, really, that might not necessarily be viable or practical for many players, which is why a decent and competitive single-player campaign is something that should have been a greater focus for the developers. And it's just immensely frustrating that it seemed to be really low priority, and that the game's actual design seems to contradict the idea of fair, competitive, and sportsmanlike racing. And yeah, I am fully aware of the apparent contradiction in the fact that I have so many complaints about almost every aspect of Gran Turismo 7's design and even like the core philosophy behind why the studio made the game, but I still can't stop playing it. It really does baffle me how the actual driving can feel so good and be so addictive, but yet Polyphony managed to bungle just about every other element of the game's design and execution, at least in my opinion. The cynical critic in me says that this is a bad game, and I should just stop playing it, and I shouldn't be recommending it to anybody. But the gamer in me just wants to keep driving and perfecting my techniques and enjoying it because the driving is fun. As I said in my previous video about the motion steering, the actual driving in Gran Turismo is amazing, and it really deserves to be in a better all-around game. Anyway, this will probably be the last video that I'll make about Gran Turismo 7, unless Polyphony releases some kind of massive game-changing update or DLC, or if I maybe get really, really deep into multiplayer and want to talk about that. This video was available exclusively to patrons for a couple weeks before going live to the general public, and same thing with the previous video. In fact, by the time that previous video about the motion steering was released publicly, this video was already available to patrons. So if you'd like to see future content early, you too can help support my content creation by becoming a patron. My plans for upcoming projects include an essay about Elden Ring's narrative delivery, a video about how my personal beliefs probably influenced my favorite game series, and vice versa, And I'm hoping to try a video about one of my favorite tabletop board games. That one will be a pretty new and interesting project, and I'm kind of excited to give that a try and see how it turns out. In the meantime, I'll also be working on the next installment of How Madden Fails to Simulate Football. The topic of that next episode was voted upon by my patrons back in October, and voting is another privilege that patrons at higher tiers can take advantage of. Your support helps me to offset the costs of maintaining my blog, the subscription costs of the software that I use to create these videos, research materials, and so on. It also helps to keep these videos free of intrusive ads, sponsorships, and so forth. The COVID years were rough on my patrons, and I sadly lost almost all of my supporters due to financial struggles. So I do want to take a moment to thank those of you who stuck with me. I really appreciate your support. And I would also like to offer my best wishes to my former patrons. I really honestly do hope that you're all doing well and that the year or two since COVID has been better for you. You know, if you can and you want to come back and continue to support me again, I'd love to have you back. And I would also like to spend a moment to offer my sincere thanks in advance to any future patrons. Thank you for your support, and thank you, as always, for watching.